Hello? Is this thing live now? Can someone type something in the chat? I think there might be a delay. Oh, sorry, I see it. Can someone say something again? Hello? Okay, I think we'll get started with the workshop. Um, so, hi guys. Welcome to the CSE Education Subcom MERN Fullstack workshop. I'm Max. I'm part of the CSE Education Subcom. Our goal is just to teach anyone interested in things about ComSci, such as how to create web apps, which is what I'll be focusing on today. So this workshop is just meant to be like a bit of a walkthrough on how to create web apps, or like more specifically, we're going to be using one of the more popular methods called the MERN stack. If some of this terminology, like MERN stack, full stack, or web apps, is a bit confusing, don't worry, we'll go through all of it bit by bit. If you guys have any questions, just feel free to ask, and hopefully me or one of the other CSE education members in the chat can help you out. And we can go through some questions at the end as well. Um, we'll just go through a bit of an introduction to give some context on web apps. So I expect some of you to have just finished Comp 1511, and if you're like me at the time, you might be wondering, like, where is my comp sci degree actually going to take me? What applications will I actually be building? Because it's a bit difficult to, I guess, visualize it if you're just using, your VLab terminal and your gedit. But if you go into something like data science, you might use Python. If you go into trading, you might, use C++ or Java. If you plan on doing something like hardware, like phones, you might use C. But you could also go into web application development, which is what we'll be focusing on today. So let's talk about what a web app is. So a web application or a web app is an application software that runs on a web browser, so like Google, Firefox, or Safari. Um, so it runs inside these browser programs rather than running on your terminal locally or natively on your operating system, like a desktop app or maybe like a mobile phone app. Um, there are a lot of different ways to make web apps, different languages you can use. The front end is usually created with HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together, but there are lots of frameworks you can use. There are lots of different technology stacks you can use. Some examples of web apps are just YouTube, GitHub, Facebook, Airbnb, and Canva. So like anything you can access in your browser, really. I talked a bit about frameworks before. A framework is basically just like a bunch of pre-written code that addresses very common issues for developers, so you don't have to deal with them. They usually make you write your code in like a new specific way, but the downsides of just having to write your code in a new syntax is usually offset by the benefits of using a particular framework may give you. Um, so what is a technology stack? A tech stack is a combination of tools, applications, and services to build a complete application. In our case, we'll be building a web app. For a web app tech stack, you have your front-end UI technology, which is again usually written in HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You'll have your backend server code, and you'll have your database of choice as well. And you also likely need servers to host all three of these components. So, for example, for the front end, you'll have a server hosting your um, front-end code, and when a user tries to visit your particular URL, your server will give them like the packages that they require to actually, I guess, run your web app inside their own browser. Backend code is just, people will be sending HTTP requests to your backend server, and your own backend server will process that request however it is implemented. We'll talk a bit about HTTP requests later. And a database is just, you want to persist any changes that a user may do. So like for example with Facebook, right? You don't want to keep adding your friends every time you start Facebook, right? You want that data to be saved somewhere so when the user comes back, they'll have all this information kind of saved and they can like re-access it and save their progress, I guess. These three components are really just the main fundamental components that you as a full stack web developer will be interacting with. A popular example of a web development tech stack is the MERN stack, which is what we'll be focusing on today. So the MERN stack is an acronym for different components of its tech stack. For our front end, we'll have React, which is the R in MERN stack. React is a framework that is based on JavaScript, HTML, and CSS. Most front-end implementations are based on these three coding technologies. HTML and CSS aren't really languages, but JavaScript is. But nevertheless, you'll be using all three in tandem together to create your front-end applications. We don't have too much time to go in depth into all three of these technologies, but we will have some brief overviews of these later in the tutorial. So the next component of the MERN stack will be Node.js. So Node.js basically lets you run JavaScript for your server backend. This is necessary because plain JavaScript, it runs in your browser. So like I said before, it runs in your Google Chrome, Firefox, and Safari, rather than your actual like terminal or your native runtime environment. But Node.js lets us actually run it in our like terminal instead. It uses JavaScript to, it's basically transfers JavaScript into your terminal essentially. So, oh whoops, yeah. So the E in the MERN stack stands for Express. It's basically a framework for Node.js, and it just makes writing your HTTP endpoints much easier. And for our database technology for the MERN stack, we use MongoDB. Now, I just want to say that the choices for these technologies, it's just like a popular combination, but you can swap these out for like a bunch of different things, and you can still make a very good functioning web app. So for MongoDB, you might swap it for MySQL. For React, you might change it with a different front-end framework like Svelte or Angular. It's these like choices for our tech stack. It's not like necessarily the most important thing. It really depends on a case-by-case basis. But today we will be focusing on these four as a combination. So that is a brief introduction into the MERN stack. Let's create something, which is the point of the demo today. Our full stack project will be a very, very simple web app. So basically all we're going to be doing is we're going to create a system that lets a user register an account, and then they'll be able to log into that account, and then they'll be able to re-access all the information that they previously registered with. So what actually happens is in our front end, a user will register an account. The front end will send a HTTP request to our backend server. Our backend server will then store this information into our database. And when the user tries to log in, the front end again will send a HTTP request to the backend with the user's authentication information, so just their username and password. And then the backend server will go to our database and try to find the relevant object or data, and the database will send this back to the backend server, and then our backend server will send this back to the front end. So yeah, that's basically what we're going to be making. I guess we'll just jump straight into coding. Let me see if there's any questions. The distinction between a web app and a website, um, I'm pretty sure a web app is just more interactive, but I'm sure like a quick Google search will have like a much more comprehensive explanation as to the difference between those two. When someone says React, does it refer to all three of those? So React is React itself is a library. So essentially what it does is you can use JavaScript, HTML, and CSS on its own to create a front end. But what React does is it combines all three of those for you as a developer just to make the process a lot easier. And it also does a lot of optimizing for you in the under the hood, but you don't need to worry about that too much. It just helps you write your front end code, but it is not necessary to make a front end. The language used for our MERN stack is JavaScript. So Node.js is basically it normally when you, I think this will be more clear later on, but just to quickly overview again, JavaScript runs in your browser. So when you write a server, you're not hosting your server in a browser, you're hosting it in a cloud service, but you by using Node.js, we can now run JavaScript no longer inside the actual browser. We can run it in our actual terminal and our native environment, which lets us create our backend. React is for front. Yeah, so React is for front end. Node.js is for back end, and Express is a framework for Node.js that helps you write your backend. It's just an add-on. But there are lots of different things you can add to Node.js, and Express is just one of those things. If there are no more questions, I guess we'll get stuck into coding. Let me just make a new folder to code in. Just all right. So this is gonna be our. Wait, sorry. Give me a second, guys. I just need to open something. Okay. So now I've got my VS Code open. Before we actually get into like creating our stuff, I'll just quickly, very briefly go over HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. You might be wondering, how we actually get JavaScript into the browser, right? I've been talking about JavaScript runs in the browser, but how do we actually do that? The way you do it is you attach your JavaScript to a HTML page. So let's create a HTML page first. Right now, if you don't know what I'm using right now, this is just called VS Code. If you're coming from 1511 and you've been using gedit, VS Code is just like a text editor. It's similar to gedit. It's just where you write your code, and you can like pull up a terminal here as well. Just like make it underneath. So it's just like a lot more convenient. And it has like a lot of great extensions that you can add to make your life easier as a developer. One of them that I want to highlight right now is just Emmet.js. What it does is it gives you like a lot of shortcuts, so you can create like code that normally you repetitively use much faster. So for example, in a HTML page, you always need some boilerplate code at the very start. Using Emmet, I can just put a exclamation mark, hit tab, and it'll auto-generate this code for us. Now, first let's just write something here. Okay, so this HTML file, it should render the two words hello world, right? Now, the main way to, wait, I'll just wrap my code around. Okay. Yep. So the main way to open a HTML file is you want to go into the directory where you saved your HTML file. So I hope everyone can see we have MERN Stack Workshop, which is the directory that I'm working in right now, and this is our HTML file, right? So let's just click it, and popped up in another window, but I'll just copy paste the URL here. And this is our HTML file, right? So if we, make an edit to it, save that, and then we refresh, you can see that our changes are reflected on our HTML page. Before we do anything, I'm gonna start this HTML page using Live Server. Live Server is just another VS Code add-on. Let me find it here, this one. What it does is, instead of having to constantly refresh every time I make a new change to our HTML file, the page will auto refresh for us. So I'll open with Live Server. So now you can see if I save something, it's just automatically refreshed. So yeah, just very briefly into HTML, we use HTML, CSS, and JavaScript together to create our front ends. HTML can be thought of as the skeleton of our web page. CSS can be thought of as the styling of the web page, so how we make it prettier, how we lay out things. And JavaScript is, I guess, how we add interactivity to our page to make it a bit more complex. Normally when you use HTML, there are things called tags. Each tag serves like a different purpose, and it usually renders a different thing on the screen. So for example, a H1 tag normally creates bold text. A paragraph tag creates, smaller text that, you would use as a paragraph, right? There's input boxes you can create. Type text. Now I can type text into this input box. But you can see how all the things I'm rendering onto our HTML page, it's very blank. It's not very stylized. It doesn't look that good, right? It's just like a skeleton. And what we would do is we add CSS to our HTML page, and that allows us to make it look a bit better. So, for example, we'll just create a CSS file. So style.css, and then just to add this CSS file to our HTML file, we need to link it. To link it, we just got to use, wait, let me just grab this. I don't have this memorized off by heart, so I'm just going to copy paste it in here. But now we have officially linked our CSS style sheet to our HTML. Anything we write in here will be reflected in the elements here. So for example, we have a H1 tag. Let's grab that tag and let's make the color Alice blue. Sure, okay, that was autocomplete, but now you can see the color of the text has changed, right? We can grab the entire document, so body of the HTML tag, and we can make it blue. Oh, sorry, background color. Right? So we basically use CSS to style our HTML to make it look a bit better, right? But I'm just going to get rid of all of this because we don't need this for now. The reason I actually brought up the HTML page again was to talk you guys through JavaScript, right? So like linking a CSS page to our HTML file, we're going to link a JavaScript file to our HTML file. So we're going to call it scripts.js. And we're going to link this as well. Let me just grab the script tag. Again, I'm not going very in-depth with these technologies. There are tons of resources online that you can go to, that you can take a look at yourself. We will be providing some of these resources at the end of this workshop. So don't be too afraid of all these technologies. They're not too hard to get the basics of, and once you get the basics, you can kind of hit the ground running. It's not too bad. But yeah, let's just get stuck into JavaScript. So in JavaScript, it's just like similar like any coding language. You know, you create variables, let x equals 5 and all that. But again, JavaScript doesn't necessarily run in your terminal by default. So how do we access it? We access JavaScript through the browser, right? But where in the browser is our JavaScript being run? Or at least where can we see what's going on? There's this thing in our browser or in all browsers like Firefox, Safari, and Google Chrome. They should all have this. It's called a console. So to access your console, you can either right click and click inspect and go to the console tab here, or you can just press F12 on your keyboard and you will also get to your console. JavaScript doesn't have a terminal like by default, or at least it doesn't output the terminal by default. It outputs to our console. So you can kind of think of our console as, I guess, just like where all your print statements will go. Kind of treat it like your console for now, on a very, very basic, high-level sense. So obviously, you know, when you have your C programs, your Python programs, your Java programs, you have your print statements, right? So how are we going to print our JavaScript to our console or our terminal? We use this function called console log. Also, you'll notice I'm just typing a shortcut to actually create our like the full name of the function. This again is just another extension. It's like probably, I don't know. You can just search up like JavaScript snippets and something will come up. There's like a lot of yeah, it's probably this one. You know, you just get a lot of shortcuts for any like very common programming lines that you will write. But yeah, let's just console log our x. Right, let's save. And right, so I spelled this wrong. Now you can see our 5, right? It's printed to our console. You know, it's just like any other coding language, right? You can reassign a variable, 5 equals 6, x equals 6, it changes to 6. You can have arrays, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You have your array here, but you might notice that we didn't necessarily give x a type before, so you can see that we're changing it from a integer to an array. If you're just coming from 1511 or like C, this might be a bit strange to you because I know in C you have to type your everything, but in JavaScript you can dynamically change the type of a variable by default. Yeah, you can, you know, it's just any programming language. You can create functions, so function, func test, and then you have your arguments, and then console log hello, right? And then we'll just call this function, so func test, and then there is our hello, right? One thing about JavaScript I want to touch on right now, because we'll be using it a lot later, are arrow functions. So it's just another way to create functions. They look like this, so you know, we'll just let func2 equals. This is basically another way you can create a function. It looks a bit weird, I know, but it's called an arrow function. The reason why is because there's this little arrow here. But it's just another syntax of writing it, right? You have your function name here, you have your arguments that go into here, and then you have the actual code here, right? So, you know, let's just control, paste that there. Let's get rid of this. And then we can just call this function as well. And you get the same thing, right? It says hello, right? You can... Wait. Just let me double check. Is everything kind of okay size? Can everyone see it properly? I'm just worried that the console log might be a bit small. I'm just gonna zoom in and move on, I guess. Yeah, so what have I touched on? Right, so now we've touched on arrow functions, which is something we're going to be using a lot later. One last thing I do want to touch on is something in JavaScript called objects. Now, in C, you might have had some experience with structs. In Python, maybe dictionaries, and in Java, just like classes in general. JavaScript has its own kind of version called objects. So you would create a variable and an object, And then a main way to create an object is by using curly brackets, and then inside you would write, you basically give a key to a value, and then you can access that value later via the key. So for example, key 1, and this refers to the integer 2, right? So let's just comment all of this out, and then let's console log object key 1. So what this is doing, essentially now you can see our 2 is being shown on our console log. We are essentially going to the object, and we are finding the value that is stored inside the, or at least is referred to by this key. You can create like different variables, so like, key 2 can hold maybe an array, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We'll swap that to key 2. And now you get your array. You can do objects within objects, so object 1, 2, sub key 1. So now you can see we have an object within our object. We can just console log the entire object as well, and you can go in deeper to like look at your sub objects. You can also put functions inside objects. So one way to do that would be, I think, function console log. Wait, I'll just write an arrow function here to make it a bit better. There. Okay, so now we have put a function inside our object. So we can call this function by doing this. And now we are inside our object, right? So functions within objects are actually called methods. So we'll be referring to any function within the object a method from this point forward. But if we look at our console right now, the first thing it says is object, and the second thing it says is undefined. So the reason for this is because what's going on is we are first calling our method, and then inside the method we call a console log, which renders our, or at least outputs our inside object string. And then we are also like console logging afterwards what this method returns. But since we didn't give it a return value, it just returns undefined. So if we just do return 5, right? Now the second line says 5. So this is just a brief overview of JavaScript, HTML, and CSS, just to make things a bit easier when we work with React and Express. Is the console big enough now? Trooper D. Just gonna assume it is. And yeah, so those are the basics of CSS, JavaScript, and HTML. We'll just get stuck into building our backend now. Like I said before, for our backend, we're going to be using Node.js and Express as well. You need to actually download Node.js for your actual computer. Just search up Node and then click download, and then just follow the instructions. Like, well, there aren't really any, but pick the relevant system that you're on and just download it. And what this essentially lets us do is it lets us run our JavaScript on our machine, and we can now output it into the terminal. So like you've been seeing before, we were putting it into our console, but now we can, by downloading Node, I already have it downloaded, so I don't need to, but once you guys download Node, you can just do Node and then just write your function, your file name afterwards, and it now prints to the terminal. So let's just uncomment all our code and show that it all works. So like you guys can see, we're console logging our array, which is reflected on the terminal. Our random string is reflected on the terminal. The string inside the method is reflected in the terminal. It just basically lets us run JavaScript on our machine. Yeah, so using Node, we can now write our backend. I'm going to make another folder called API, and it's going to create a server folder. Oh, not folder, file, sorry. And it's just, I'm also going to use a tool called Postman. Postman is going to help us with creating our HTTP endpoints. It just lets us send dummy HTTP requests, and also shows us what the backend is returning as a response. You can just go download Postman on your browser. It's this one. Yeah, just download it, and then I'll show you how to use it in a second. But we've been talking a lot about HTTP requests. I think we'll just go through it real quick together. So HTTP requests are one of the most popular methods to exchange data across the internet. If you go to this YouTube live right now and you double click like the URL, you should see HTTPS at the start. So that shows that like you being on this like YouTube website itself, it starts from a HTTP request. When you go onto this YouTube live, your browser is sending a request for data pertaining to this page, and once it receives that like program from YouTube, your browser will start working, and it starts loading like the program that YouTube sent it, and that is what you are seeing on your page. Your page is the YouTube program that YouTube sent back to your browser using the HTTP request inside your URL search bar. HTTP requests, they're not just like web pages either. You can get raw data. So one of the most popular forms of data is JSON data. JSON is just a way of formatting data. It's actually just a string. We'll be working with JSON data for this application, but the data inside can be anything. So let's say you're getting data about a blog, right? So like you're on your front end, you've written your blog. The data inside your JSON could be just like a massive string holding all your blog text, right? Here's an example of some JSON data, right? You can search this in your browsers as well, right? I'll just post it in the chat, right? You can go to this. You can just put this URL in your own browser, and you'll be able to see like JSON data as well. Note that the way this is formatted in my Firefox is a bit different if you're using Google Chrome. If you're like using another web browser like Chrome, let me just double check. Yeah, so like in Chrome, it'll just look like this. This is what you're basically getting back. Just it should be a string, and then you have a key and then a value. It's similar to an object in JavaScript, a dictionary in Python, and every language has its own way of handling JSON data, I guess, because it's so common to use. There are many different HTTP request methods, but the 5 main methods are get, put, post, patch. So I don't know if this is too small. Hopefully you can see it. Yeah, so basically these methods indicate what your HTTP request should be trying to do. So for example, if we're trying to get data, right, we would use a get request. If we're trying to, let's say, post data and create a user and save that to our database, we would use a post request. If we want to delete something, we would use a delete request. These are all just different methods for HTTP requests, and you just use them based on what you your HTTP request endpoint should be doing, or like the general functionality of it. Yeah, that's a brief overview of HTTP requests. Does anyone have any questions on HTTP requests? Because then otherwise we'll just start building our own. There is kind of a delay in the YouTube live, so if anyone has a question, just feel free to send it halfway through me talking, and if I catch it, I'll try answer it. So now we're going to be building our Node backend, right? And we're going to be using Postman to help us with that. Let me just get that like that. All right. So first thing we have to do for our Node backend is we're going to download Express. Actually, even before that, we have to npm init. And then we're going to put -y. So what npm init does is it basically asks you a bunch of questions like pertaining to like general information about your current project, you know, like its name, its version, just things like that. And we're just going to put -y to autocomplete all of it. And I have forgotten to change my directory, so I'm just going to change it to API. And then we're going to npm init again. And we're going to put a -y. And now we have created a JSON package.json file. So what happens in this package.json file is basically it keeps track of all the dependencies that your project is currently using. Any third-party libraries you happen to use for your project, it'll be kept track of in here. It'll also keep track of the version that you're using. And this is required, like the npm init is required to actually be able to interact with the npm ecosystem. The npm ecosystem is basically just a bunch of third-party developers have written code and npm packages that you can use. You can download that into your project and you can just use their code because they've already written it for you, so why not? Express is one of these npm packages. So to download Express, we just type it in the terminal. Hopefully my terminal is big enough, but you just type npm I. I stands for install, and then we just write the package that we want, which for us is going to be Express right now. And now you can see in our package.json, we have our dependencies, and it says Express here. This wasn't here before, but since we've now downloaded Express into our project, our JSON package is going to keep track of that. And it also keeps track of the particular version of Express that we're using. The Express code itself is downloaded into your Node modules. So this is where the actual code that you've downloaded stays, right? And now we can start using Express in our own project. So to start using Express, we're going to import Express. And now we've basically grabbed the default export that the Express package gives us, which is this Express object. Now, this Express object basically gives us access to the Express package that we've downloaded. And the first thing we're going to do is we are going to create an instance of Express, and we're going to name this instance app. And to create it, we're going to write Express, and we're going to call the function, right? And now we can create our backend server. We can get it live by writing app.listen. Now remember our objects, right? Everything in JavaScript is an object. So this app, like the thing we get returned from Express, it's an object. The Express function itself, it's an object. Everything in JavaScript is an object. So we'll just do app.listen, and we'll call a method from the object, because remember you can put functions inside objects, just like our app object has one of these methods, and we're gonna call it. And the first argument we give it is the port that it's going to be running on. Let's make it port 8000. And it also takes in a function, and this function will run when the server runs. So we're going to give it a arrow function, and we're just going to console log server is running on port 8000, sorry, 8000. I'm going to save it, and then we're just going to start our Express app by doing node server.js. And now you can see that we get an error. The reason for this error is because we've used an import statement up here. A lot of times, I think older versions of JavaScript use, like when you try to import a package, it would be something like express equals require express, something like this, right? But in newer versions of JavaScript, you can use this import syntax, but you do need to enable it by changing it in your package.json. So we're just gonna take this line here and we're gonna paste it here. And now it should work. So let's save our Express file. And now you can see our server is running on port 808. So essentially what we've done is we've created our backend. Like our backend is up and running. As you can see, this program isn't ending, right? Like this line, it's not reappearing. It's because this server is designed to perpetually run, right? So when you go visit Facebook, you obviously, or like I said before, YouTube, the YouTube servers will send you back, a package like a program, right? That your front end can use, right? This endpoint for your YouTube to hand you stuff, it has to be running perpetually, right? If it goes down, you can't access YouTube. It's similar to any backend server, right? The backend server has to constantly be running, has to constantly be listening for HTTP requests. So the fact that our server is continuously running is, it's a good thing. It's not breaking, guys. So it's okay. Now we have created our backend and we've got it to run. We can now create our actual endpoints, right? So we're going to create a HTTP endpoint, just a very simple one for a GET request. So like I said before, there are 5 main methods and GET requests are one of them. To create it, this app object that we get back from calling this express function, it doesn't just have one listen method, it has like a lot of different methods. And one of these methods is called get. So get. And the first argument to the get request, the get method, is the URL string that we're going to need to use to actually hit this get request endpoint. The second argument that we give this method is a function. And what happens is that when we send a HTTP request to hit our endpoint here, it's going to execute this function, right? So that's how we actually create the functionality of our backend for the MERN stack. This function itself takes another 2 arguments. The first one is request, and the second one is response. I just want to point out, like, this stuff, it comes with Express, not Node. Just wanted to make that distinction. You can create endpoints in Node without using Express, but Express just makes it a lot easier for us. So the request argument that we give our function argument, it has details about the HTTP request that's coming into the endpoint. And the response argument that we are given, we manipulate this response argument to return data back to whoever sent us the original HTTP request. So what we'll first do is we'll console log inside get endpoint. And then we're also going to send stuff back to the front end. not the front end, just whatever happens to send us a HTTP request. But in our current case, we'll be using Postman. So uh, response dot status 200 dot JSON message. Okay, so basically what we've done here is when we hit this particular URL, the first thing that's going to happen is we're going to console log this message, so it'll appear down here in our terminal. And the second thing we're going to do is we're going to send back a response. The first thing that it will send back is the status of the response. Statuses are just kind of a way to tell the initial sender of the HTTP request what exactly happened with the request. There are lots of different status codes, but anything starting with 2 is usually a good thing. Anything starting with 4 means it failed. Anything starting with 5 means that it failed and I think your server is down. So we're going to save this and we have to restart our server for our changes to take effect. And now we're going to send our HTTP request. So it should be on localhost and we're on port 8000, sorry. 8000 and there's our endpoint. Now we're going to send this GET request and now you can see we get message inside GET request and we've also console logged inside GET request endpoint. So that's it. At this point we've created our first HTTP endpoint, right? Just to clarify on what the first argument is, right? It's the segment of your URL that comes after your root URL. So for us, our root URL will be, localhost 8000. For YouTube, the base URL will just be youtube.com. For Facebook, it will just be facebook.com. We can put something else inside like get request. And then we're going to have to restart our server again. And if I try send to this localhost endpoint again, it's not going to work because we have changed what the actual endpoint is. So to actually hit this endpoint, we're going to have to write get request afterwards. And now you can see it's working as it was before. Another thing I just want to do real quick is, as you can see, I have to keep restarting my server every time I want a change in my server to be reflected in what's actually running. There is another npm package I can install to make our life easier. It's called NodeMon. And what happens is when you start your server with NodeMon, any changes you save to your backend server files, it automatically triggers a restarting of the server. So let's just download it real quick, npm I nodemon. And we're going to give it a flag called savedev. Now, the reason we need to add savedev at the end of this is because nodemon isn't necessary for our backend to work, right? It restarts our server when we save changes to our files. It's for us as developers. It makes our life easier, but it doesn't actually affect the way the actual program runs. It's just for us. So I'm just gonna save it. And then if you look at our package.json, right now you can see that there's a dependency object here. Once node1 downloads, there should be another object. Here it is. It's called dev dependencies, and now you can see our package.json is also keeping track of the nodemon. The actual files for nodemon are now probably in our node modules, but now we're going to start our server with nodemon, and then we're just going to server.js. And you can see now our server is working as it was before. If we make another GET request, same thing happens. We're inside the GET endpoint. Let's do it again. You can see it's just creating more and more console log statements. But also, now you can see if we make any changes to our get request our server, if I delete the endpoint or at least the segment of the endpoint and I save, it restarts our server for us, and now I can just send another get request and it works just as it did before. So this is just the basics of our HTTP endpoints. Now let's create some endpoints that we will actually be using. So if you guys remember from what we're going to be creating in our app, we're going to be making a way for users to register and a way for users to log in, right? So let's create our register endpoint first. Because we are giving the server data and then this data is to be saved, we're going to be using a post request. If you guys remember when I was talking about the different request methods, get is for getting data, post is for creating data, put is for updating data, and delete is for deleting data. So we're going to be using post for this one, and we're going to give it a endpoint called register. Yeah, okay, so you spell it. And then we also need to give it the function argument like we did with get. If you want to create a method, a HTTP method endpoint with a HTTP endpoint for other methods, you just do app.delete is another one. You can do app.put is another one, and when you send a put request, it'll hit this endpoint. If you make a delete request, it'll hit this one. For us, we're going to be creating a post one, so we're going to use post as the method. But they all take the same two arguments, or at least the same two first arguments. The first one is the actual HTTP endpoint URL, and the second one is a function that is executed when this endpoint is hit. So what are we going to do with this register? We're going to take user data and we're going to save it into our database, right? Let's start off by just console logging all our data that we get. So the first two arguments, we need request and response, and we're going to use a middleware function. Middleware functions are part of Express. They're a bit complex to go into for now, but the general gist of it is it sits between the middle of your HTTP request endpoint and the request sender. So when a HTTP request source sends a request, it'll hit the middleware first. The middleware will process that request, and then the middleware will then give that request to the next, either the next middleware, or it will just give it straight to the endpoint, depending on if you made another middleware to intercept more requests. So to use middleware, we're going to use another different method from the app object, and it's called use. And then the middleware that we're going to give it is part of the Express object that we imported called Express.json. So essentially what this does is when you send a HTTP request, you can add data to that request as part of the body. Now, this data on the body is actually inaccessible at the start for your HTTP endpoints, at least in Express. What you need to do is you need to call this function on every single request that comes in, and it essentially takes the data on the request body and it will create a property inside your request object called body, which is a bit confusing, but inside this body property is now the data that the source HTTP request had in its own body. Right? If that's a bit confusing, feel free to ask any questions about it. So yeah, let's just grab the data first. We can just console log request.body, and we can actually just send it back as well. So res.status 200.json request.body. Okay, so we're going to save this. Our endpoint is our server's going to restart, and we're going to now send a post request to this URL. So again, it's localhost 8000, but we're going to use register as our as the final segment of our URL. Someone's having an issue with downloading Node.js. Not too sure what the issue is with the context that you've given. Maybe you've downloaded Node incorrectly, or maybe you've misspelt it. Um, yeah, not too sure now, but if you could send more info about your error, maybe that'll help. Maybe one of the CSE education members can help a bit more. Yes, where were we up to? Oh yeah, we were creating our endpoint, right? So we have now created our register endpoint, and we're going to send a request to it. Notice that we now need to change our the method of our HTTP request to post. So with Postman, we can do that very simply just by clicking on post here instead of get. And we need to go to the body, and we have to click raw here, and we're going to have to change this to JSON, this little drop down. And now we can start adding data to the body of our HTTP request. So we're going to put it in the form of JSON. So what should we put? Maybe just data. And then maybe we'll put like another field name John. Right, so now we have saved, or not saved, but we've written our data that is going to be put into our HTTP request, and this request is going to be sent to our backend. So let's just send it, and now you can see that we've posted this data onto our terminal, and we've also received it back, right? So if we run through it again, essentially we are creating a post request. We are sending this HTTP post request to our register endpoint. It's going to go to our server that is perpetually being run on our terminal or our local machine. It's going to hit this endpoint because, first of all, it's a post method. Second of all, we've matched the URL. And we're going to console log it, which is down here. And we're going to send it back, which is why it appears in Postman. If I get rid of the Express.json and I try to send it again, as you can see, we're not getting anything back because our body property has not been populated, because our express.json method is what actually fills this property of the request object with the data that the front end or the source of the HTTP request is sending. So save it, and then as it works like normal. Right. Another thing we need to make is our login endpoint, right? So it's also going to be a post request, not a get request. The reason why you might think it's a get request is because, you know, we're getting the user data, right? But it's actually a post request because we are sending the user's credentials to the backend. So we are sending data with this request. So that's why it's called post. I'm just going to give it a URL of login, and then just going to make an arrow function, request, response, and then we can just, you know, do the same thing. So console log in login res status 200 JSON crest.body. You can also access individual fields of the data that's in the HTTP request body, as long as you use the right name that you used in your actual request. So we're going to send a username, so we'll just send back the username. Yep. So now in our Postman, we're going to go to our login endpoint, and we're just going to do username, I don't know, L. And then our password can just be password. and we're going to send this to our endpoint. So, and you can see we are returning back just the username because we've only accessed it in our endpoint here. And we've also console logged in login down here because of line 20. So now we have the endpoints set up, but the issue is they're not actually doing anything, right? They're just taking the data and they're just console logging it and they're sending it back. But if a user registers, like when they send their user data to our backend, like it's not going to do anything, right? So we need to find a way to persist this data. This is where our backend, no, not our backend, our database comes in. The database we're going to use is called MongoDB. There is a way to connect to, there are many ways to connect to MongoDB. The way we're going to use is called Mongoose. Mongoose is another npm package that we can download. So let's quickly stop our server right now and we're going to npm install Mongoose. Now notice that I didn't use save dev here because we will be needing Mongoose for our server to actually function. And while we download, just take a look at the comments. Alright, it's downloaded. We can look at our package.json. And here you can see Mongoose is here now, whereas it wasn't before. Now we're going to actually use Mongoose to connect to our database, right? So first we need to import the Mongoose object from Mongoose, which is going to be our package. And what we're going to do is we're going to try connect to it in using this object. So what we're first going to do is we're going to create an async function. So what an async function is it's basically an asynchronous function. You have to write the keyword async before your actual function name, and then we go async function main, and then inside our main we're going to try connect to our database. So await mongoose dot connect. Right, so now we're actually going to go to our MongoDB. So let me just here. Okay. Right, so you're probably going to need to make a MongoDB account. But once you make that account, you should get onto this dashboard. And once you're here, we can now connect to our database. So you should have access to this dashboard by clicking database up here. And we're gonna connect here. And we're gonna click connect your application because we are connecting it to our backend app. And it should give you a string here. You're going to copy this string and you're going to give that as an argument to your mongoose.connect method. So it's just string and then paste. And you can see there is a username and password here. The username and password you write here, you create it yourself on your MongoDB account. You go to database access and you just create a new database user this way, right? So we're going to be using CSE Workshop. And also you're going to need to configure your network access, but that's not too hard. There are lots of different MongoDB tutorials on YouTube that can run you through this very quickly in like 10 minutes. So feel free to just YouTube it after. We're just going to add our username first. CSE Workshop, and then our password is password. And then after this, we're going to do main. We're going to actually call our main function. And we're going to write catch. What catch basically does is it catches any errors that occur inside your async function, right? And then let me just double check. Yep, okay. So console log, no, sorry, we're going to catch the error, and then once we catch this error, we're going to console log our error. Sorry, catch actually is a function, and it takes in a function as an argument. So error, and then we're going to use our arrow function again, and we're going to console log. This probably isn't going to happen during this workshop. Like this catch function isn't really going to be called, but it's just to show you that you do write this just in case anything does go wrong with your when you're trying to connect to your database. And then we're going to create a database instance variable that actually holds onto the connection between your app and the actual MongoDB database. And we're just going to create some functions to let us know the general state of the connection. So once the connection is on, if an error occurs, we're also going to console log this error. I just want to point out some things with the arrow functions. If you've noticed, these arrow functions don't actually need names, right? Like before I showed you how to create an arrow function, I gave it a name here. I equated it to a variable. You don't actually need to do this. If you're passing in this function as like an argument to something, you can just write it without the name because it doesn't need a name. And another thing is, you know, there are shorthand ways of writing it. If you only have one argument, you don't need the normal brackets outside. You can just write the variable you're passing in as is. And if you only have like one statement, you don't actually need the curly brackets outside either. You can just write that one statement as is. And so we're also going to do db, so one time when it's opened, we are going to console log connected to database. Now we're going to save this and we're going to start our server again. So node-mon server, our server is running, and now we are also connected to our database. So we are officially connected to our MongoDB database. Any data we post from our backend, it can be directly put into our database and it can be saved here. So let's start actually creating that saving function. We're going to be using something that's a part of Mongoose called Schemas and Models. It's a particular way to save data and search for data, and it is essentially just how Mongoose works. First thing we need to do is we need to create some models. So we're going to create by convention, we create a folder called models. And inside this model is where all our schemas go. And so we're going to create a schema called user.js. And we're going to go into our user file and we're going to create a schema. So I'll explain a bit about what schemas are in a second. Let me just write some stuff first. Import Mongoose from Mongoose. Import Mongoose from Mongoose. Okay, so we're going to create our first schema, or our only schema for this example actually. Const. Oh, also I'll quickly explain what const and let are, right? So const is just like a constant variable, right? So const x equals 5, right? If you were to try to change this 5 to like a 6, this will throw an error because you can't reassign the value of a const variable. Whereas if you use let, you can reassign it as you would any normal variable, and it would work. But we're just going to use const here because we don't plan on reassigning this variable. And we don't plan on ever using this variable name again. And we're going to grab the Mongoose object that we imported, and we're going to use a method called schema. And now this method takes in one argument, or at least one necessary argument, and that argument is an object. So let's create our object here. And what basically goes inside this object is, you can think of it as like kind of like the blueprint of the objects that we're going to be putting in our database. So one analogy you can think of is like cooking, in a sense, where you have your recipes, you have your ingredients, and you have your chef, and you have your final dish, right? Your schema is your recipe. It dictates what is needed for the final dish and what the final dish should kind of look like, right? Your model, it's kind of like the chef. It takes in the ingredients, makes sure that all the ingredients adheres to the recipe, and then it produces the final object. And your ingredients are just your data, like your values you get from your front end, right? So all the data we got from, the body of our request object, that is our ingredients. And the object that we're going to be putting into our database is the final end product, and it is our dish. By using schemas, it ensures that every object you put inside your database, it has certain values that are mandatory, right? So for example, for a user, you need them to have a username and a password. So if you happen to try to create a object to put in the database without giving it a username and a password, an error will be thrown and your request just won't work. So let's create our recipe, I guess, so our schema. The first thing we want because we are creating a register login function, the first thing we want is a first name, so first name, and then this property of the object argument, it gets another object, right? And inside this object, we can configure how this property is treated within our recipe or within our model. So type string, because our first name will be a string. It is required, so required true. And then we have last name, type string required true. We also have an age, so age type. Now our age is not going to be a string, it's going to be a number, so we just write number here. And it will also be required. It's going to make everything required, just for the simplicity of our example, but if you have other use cases, it's not necessary to make them all required. We're going to need a username, and it's going to be of type string, and it's going to be required. And we're going to add an extra configuration to our username. We're going to make it unique. So this means that if there is a username property inside our database, you can't create another object where the field of username is the same value as like the one already in the database. Because when you create a login system, you don't want two people having the same username, because then you can't differentiate between the two users. And then password is going to be type string, and it's going to be required, but we don't care if it's unique or not, so we're just gonna not use the unique configuration. And then we're also just gonna add a description for each user. type, and we're going to make it required. Okay, so this is our schema, right? Our recipe. Any object that we put into our database, it needs to follow this structure. So I've created some examples before when I was running through this workshop, and you can see that, I don't know if it's big enough, but you can see that they all follow the same structure, right? They all need to fill out the correct and relevant properties. If I tried to add something that didn't adhere to this recipe, the object that we put inside our MongoDB, it just wouldn't be able to be put in. It would throw an error before we actually even put it in our database. So we also now need to actually create the chef, right? Create our model. We do this by using the function or the method from the Mongoose object called model. And we're going to give it 3 arguments. The first argument is the name of the particular schema. The second one is the actual schema itself. And the third one is the collection that this schema is associated with. So if you look inside your database, right, you have your instance of a database, and then beneath you have like a sub category. These subcategories are called collections because you might have multiple models and you don't want to put all the models in the same like place, right? You want to separate them to have some order and consistency in your database. So this last one is just to keep them separate and just help you, honestly. We're gonna also need to export our Mongoose model, and we're gonna export default this, right? So what export default means is, if you see up here, when we use import, normally, and you'll see this later when we get into React, if you don't use default, you have to write it like this, right? And then this is because, a particular package or a particular file might export multiple things. You can export this, you can export 5 or like a variable, object. You can export multiple things per file. So if I wanted to grab this object, I would need to write import object, right? But if we put default at the front, we only need to import one variable. And if we don't put curly brackets there, it'll always import this one default variable, or whatever we're importing or exporting. So we've created our model and we have created our endpoints. Now we need to actually use our endpoints for our model. So let's create our register endpoint first. Let's finish it up. So the first thing we need to do is we need to actually create a new instance of our model, which is our object, which in the analogy was our dish, right? So, sorry, 1 second. We need to first create a variable to hold our dish or to hold our new user model. So user new, and then we're also going to need to import our model. So we're just going to import user from models-user.js. So now we've imported the model that we're exporting from our user schema file. And we're going to do user equals new, and then we're going to call the object that we exported. And this object takes in this object by default is a function, and the function itself takes in a argument that is a object that adheres to the schema or our recipe. So we need to put in the correct values that our schema laid out for us. So we're going to need first name, last name, age, username, password, and description, right? So you see the structure of our object, like the properties that it holds, it matches our schema, right? And we have all the required ones that we wrote down. So what about like what we're actually going to put in these properties, right? What are the ingredients? Well, we're going to get this from our request object. So request.body. So we're just going to assume that the front end has done their request properly, and that they've passed in these properties into the HTTP request body. Let me just take a look. Okay. Request body dot last name. Now, obviously, there's nothing that actually necessarily forces the front end to send particular data to the back end, right? It could very well be that the front end sends a request and it's missing some of this data. In that case, the back end will just throw an error and it will send that error back to the front end because it's not adhering to our schema. So it is up to the front end to kind of write a correct body data and a correct HTTP request. So now at this point, when a HTTP request is sent to our particular register endpoint, on that request there should be data, and our Express.json middleware is going to get that data and put it into our request object, specifically inside a property called body. And now we can access that body data, and we're going to put that data into a new object that we create, and this object is going to be passed as an argument to new user. And what this is going to create is it's going to create another object that we're going to be put into this user variable. And this user variable, it's not going to hold a plain object. We're going to be able to have other methods associated with this object, which we'll see in just a second. Now that we have created our, our dish or our object that we're going to be putting into our database, we're going to have to save it. So we're going to use a try catch bracket. So const new user equals await user dot save. And since we're using await here, we are going to have to write async in front of our function. If you're still confused about await and async, it can be a bit difficult to wrap your head around at the start. There are plenty of resources online to kind of explain it better than I can, just off the top of my head. But all you need to know again is it just waits for this to finish, basically, this function. Because if you think about it, what's happening is when we try to save our user into our database, we have to connect to the database, and then we have to actually save to the database, and then the database has to tell us that, oh yeah, it's saved correctly. Like obviously this is a bit of a process, and it's not going to happen instantly, which is why we need to have this await a keyword. And then we can just res.status 200, because if we make it to this point, then our user has been correctly saved. I'm going to do JSON, and then we are going to just return our new user to the source of the HTTP request. And then we're going to have to write up our error block. So error, and this is just going to catch any errors that are thrown when we try to save our user. Res status, and here we're going to use a 400 status code, because like I said before, 400 is the status code you return if something breaks. you can see the status codes on the return object or the response object, but for our Postman, you can see we have status 200 OK right here. We're gonna return JSON error. Actually, just call the message. Okay, so at this point, we should have basically finished our register endpoint. So let's try and create or save something to our database, right? We're gonna go to our register endpoint here, 8000, and we're gonna go to body. We're gonna make a post request, and then we're going to have to fill out all of this properly. So let's go. I can just copy this, honestly, and then just yep, all this works. It's fine. We're gonna post this data, right? So now if we take a look at our MongoDB, we're going to refresh it to take a look at any updates that's happened. And now you can see in our new user collection, we have the data we just sent, right? So we've officially put something into our database. We can change the object. Is there anyone, any suggestion? Oh wait, there's a delay. Oh, okay, I'll just put in a random name. I don't know. Ed. Okay, so now we have this brand new object, right? We're going to try save this to our database as well. We're going to send it. It's in the register. It's been sent back. We're going to look at our database. It hasn't appeared here yet. Let's refresh. There it is. Now it's connected to our database, right? We've officially created our backend server for registering. So we can really quickly do this with our login as well. For our login, we're just gonna we don't need to create a new model because we don't have any like new data. Like we don't need to create a new object to put in. We're just getting data back out. So we're just gonna immediately do a try catch block. So try catch error. Or the error should be the same, or at least the code for it should be similar. And then for the try block, we're gonna do const user. Oh, we also are gonna need to put async here because this will be an async function. Equals await user, and then we're gonna use our user object up here, and we're gonna user dot find one. And then we're going to go to our request. We're going to use the field of username because when we are sending a login request from the front end, right? What are we giving back? We're giving a username and a password, right? And the username is how we're going to identify each user, which is why we made it unique. So we're going to look for a particular username, and that username will be in the request body, and it will be called username, right? And we're going to do some check statements. So if we couldn't find the user, which means this will be null, which means this function, this if bracket will run. We're going to do res.status 404. So 404 is like another status code, but it means something has gone wrong, right? 400 status codes, like anything starting with a 4 means something has gone wrong. Anything starting with a 2 means something has gone right. So JSON, we're going to send back a message, and then we're going to put a string, user not found. And then we're going to do another statement, else if user dot password not equal the password we were given. Then we're going to do a res dot status 403 JSON message incorrect password. Incorrect. So you might be wondering, like, what's the difference between 404 and 403, and how have I chosen these numbers, or is it just arbitrary? So when we talk about HTTP requests and post requests, GET requests, and those kind of requests, there is a certain convention you follow, right? So GET requests are for if you're getting data. Post requests are if you're creating data. Put requests are for updating. Delete requests are for deleting, right? You can think of it similarly to that, right? So 404, if we do 404 status code, 404 means that like what you were looking for was not found, right? And where have we used it? We've used it when the user we are looking for cannot be found, right? What does 403 mean? 403 means forbidden response status code. So it just means that we've tried to access something that we don't have access to, right? And in this case, it's because we've given the incorrect password. So this if bracket here is basically what is authenticating our user, right? So what happens is, regardless of what password we give to our backend, the backend will always look for the user with the correct username. And then once it gets that user, it will check if the password is correct. If the password is not corrected, then we send a response back saying that something has gone wrong. And we're going to make one more else if statement. Actually, we can just make it else because there shouldn't be any more issues here. But we're just going to do else and then res.status 200 JSON user, I think should work, right? So at this point, if we've hit this if else bracket statement, it means our HTTP request was successful and we're about to send the data that the front end asked for. We're going to send it all back, right? And let's try test this out with Postman, right? We're going to go to our login. And what was our username just then? It was BB and password was password. So BB and the password is just password. Now let's send this. And now you can see, oh wait, sorry, let me just, you can see that we're getting our user back. Why is it sending that though? It should be sending the whole object back. I'm gonna try something real quick. Okay, so the user itself that we get back from the find one, right? It is itself a object, and the object itself has a property called underscore doc, and this just contains all the actual data inside that saved object, right? But if we take a look at our returned object, we can see that we're also giving back the password, right? That's not very secure. So we don't want to give the password of the user back to whoever is requesting it. So we're just going to get rid of it. And to do this, we're going to do something that's a part of JavaScript called object destructuring, I think. Basically, you can separate the actual values of an object by writing them separately. So others equals user doc. And then we're just going to give back others instead. So basically, this essentially takes this line 54 takes this object, right, and it separates the password property away from all the other properties, right? This could be named anything, but we're just going to call it others right now. But what is actually special is these three dots here. This basically collects the rest of the properties that were not like specifically referred to in this object bracket. I'm going to save this. I'm going to try send another request. And now you can see the password property is no longer inside the return request, which just makes things a bit more secure. That's it. That's our backend server done. Are there any questions? I'm gonna get into the front end for React now. We're gonna create another folder here called client. Now this is just gonna be where we put all our React code. I think we can close all this now, and we're going to create a new terminal. Actually, no, we have to create a new terminal. And we're going to change directories into our client. And now we're going to start up our React app. So to start up our React app, you just type npx create React app, right? And then you need to give it some, I think some things after. I think it's, wait, sorry, 1 second. Yeah, so after you write create React app, you can either write like the name of your project, so like CSE workshop. But what this will do is it'll create another folder within your folder that you're creating the React app in, and it's going to put the React app inside that folder. But we are currently already inside the folder we want to put our React app in, so we just put a period. And now our React app should be starting to download. So you can see our client is slowly filling up with stuff. And yeah, this part usually might take a little while. So does anyone have any questions? Because I think we have like a bit of time now while we wait for the React app to download. Oh wait, there's a delay. Oh well. But if this tutorial is a bit fast, or there's something you don't understand, first of all, like, this thing is recorded, so feel free to just go back and rewatch whichever parts you're like unsure of. If like the HTML part, the CSS part, and the JavaScript part was a bit fast, that's very understandable, right? We didn't really go through it in depth. There are plenty of resources on YouTube you can look for. The main purpose of this workshop is kind of just to show you what can happen, right? Just give you like a bit of a taste of a full stack application. But HTML and CSS itself, you can get familiar with it in like an hour or two just by watching like 1 or 2 YouTube videos. We will be trying to give out some resources to help you at the end of this workshop. So hopefully we can get that out at the end. Yeah. Um, I'm not sure if you need to change anything when you're deploying your Express server to the internet. There's probably some things you need to configure. Uh, there might be some environmental variables you'll need to set up because obviously you're not going to be running your Express on your like localhost port 3000, right? Like it's going to be depending on like your service provider or your hosting provider, so might have to check into that. Okay, our React app is done. So we can just, okay, wait, let me check. Okay, our database is still running. Now, we've downloaded our React app, right? And we put it all into this client folder. I might just make another folder. So HTML, CSS, JS. I'm just gonna put all of this in here because we don't need to look at it. But yeah, so this is the folder we're going to be using for our React app. Node modules, it's the same with our own Node module. It just has like a bunch of files that you don't need to worry about. This is probably where React lives. No, this is where React lives. But the two main files that you get that you need to worry or even look into is you get a public file and you get a source file. So let's first start up our React app, right? And see what we're working with. Yes. Alright, so let's go to port 301 because that's where our React app is running. And let's just do that, right? So now we're in our React app. Let's take a look at the files we got. First of all, let's take a look at index.html, right? So like I said before, the way you kind of get into your JavaScript file is you link it to a HTML file. This is similar with React. You need a root HTML file that essentially what happens is all your JavaScript files are injected into this HTML file. And that's how a lot of your code is rendered. If I can zoom out a bit. If it's a bit too small, I'm sorry about that, but if you just take a look at the general code here, the main one is this root, right? What happens with React, because everything in the head, right, this head tag, it's not actually rendered on your page. What you see on your web page is this body tag, right? And this root div is the most important part when it comes to this rendering. If we go to our console log or our developer tools in our browser, we can open Inspector and we can take a look at our app. So you can see the root div here, and this is where everything is injected to, right? Everything else in here you don't really need to know about. Honestly, when you're making your own like projects to start off with, like nothing super big or super complex, you can just delete everything except for the index.html. Like don't delete this one, but everything else can be deleted. Um, for app, for your source file is basically where your actual React app lives. Like all the code that you yourself write. Everything Facebook wrote for you, most of it is in here, this node module, because React is created and maintained by Facebook, and but the code you write lives in this source folder. Specifically, most of it is going to be put into your app component. So we'll just have a real quick overview. First, let me clean this up because we don't need most of this stuff. Just delete all of this. Okay, and then just gonna. Everything I just deleted isn't necessary for like a very simple web app. A lot of it is like checking performance and like things like that. But just gonna. Okay, apparently we need the logo. Okay, you know what? Let's just not delete everything. I guess we do need it. there we go. Okay, let's just not touch anything anymore. Okay. So basically, the way React works is we have a public folder, we have a HTML file, and we're going to link all our JavaScript into this HTML file via this root tag, right? So if we look at index.js, this is basically grabbing the root tag, and it is dumping our app component, which is here, onto this root div. So if we look at our code inside app, you can see a header, images, paragraphs, all this. And if we look at our console log, if I zoom in, we don't need this, all this. If we zoom in, we can see our root tag. If we open it up, we'll see our app component. And then if we open that up, we'll see our app.header. And you can see it just mimics the layout of all of this, right? So, if we delete all of this, what happens? We delete everything, right? Which is what we want because we're going to be creating our own custom React app. Let's write hello world just to check that things are working. And you can see at the top, there is our hello world, right? We're also going to delete a lot of the CSS because we're going to do it ourselves. Just get rid of all of this. You don't really need to know what I'm doing for the CSS part of this. There is a lot of not really advanced, but there's a lot of stuff to do with CSS that we just don't really have time for in this workshop. But I'm just gonna style it to make things look a bit better. Okay, basically all I did was just I put everything into the middle. So you might have heard me use the word component before. So what is a component? A component is just basically our way of sectioning off our app, right? If we take a look at MongoDB, because MongoDB uses React as well, right? Think of everything as a component. So this sidebar is a component. This window is a component. This other sidebar is a component. Let's not go there. We are basically creating encapsulated parts of the UI, right? And then we add it all together at the end, right? So let's just create another component for ourselves right now. First we'll make a folder called components, just to make it a bit neater. And then inside, we need two components, right? We need a register component and a login component. So register.js, and we're just gonna RFC. So RFC is basically another one of those shortcuts that I showed you guys before with extensions. You can get it with just any. There's probably a React extension here somewhere. Here's one. Here's another one. They're all called snippets, right? But they just are hotkeys. And we're going to import this component into our main component. So we're gonna, and components are written just like tags. So register, and then we've imported our register component, and we're just gonna fill it up, and then save. And then if we look at our React app, now it says register. If I get rid of this component, if I save, it says register. It doesn't say register. If I save it again, it'll say register. If I edit what's in this register, hello, it'll be reflected in our main app, right? So think of it as kind of like Lego in a sense, but in a tree direction. So you have your main Lego piece and you're kind of branching downwards, and then you kind of put it all together and it slowly goes upwards and you make one final app. Let's, I guess, create our register component first. So the point of our components, right, for our register is we're trying to make a component that users can log into, right? We want this user to interact with this register component. So what we're going to do is we're going to just, wait, sorry, 1 second. we're gonna want to create a like the UI for the register. How do we do this? Well, we're gonna use HTML, but you might be asking like, why am I writing HTML in a JavaScript file, right? So this is what I mean when I said before that React kind of combines HTML, JavaScript, and CSS together. Um, you can write HTML inside your JavaScript. Um, and this is because of a particular feature called JSX that's a part of React. Essentially, what happens is your components are functions, right? Or we call them functional components. Uh, the thing you return is HTML, and the code inside your function changes like the HTML, and it changes it dynamically, which is part of why we use React, right? It helps you create dynamic web pages. If a user clicks on something, you want that to maybe reflect something else. It's done through this dynamic interaction between your JavaScript and your HTML that you return from your JSX functions. So to create our register block, right, we're first going to need to write the HTML for this. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a form, right, because the form is just another HTML tag that wraps around a particular group of inputs, and it kind of just makes it a form. Just think of it as like any form you fill out online, right? Like a survey or like internship application, right? Just you wrap it around all your input boxes to kind of create one form, and then we can create our input boxes. So input type text, and we're gonna put placeholder first name. So now you can see we have an input box, right? And we can type stuff in. This is where our users are going to be typing their data, and where we're going to say send. Like we're going to get the data from the user, and then we're going to get the data inside these input boxes and send it to the backend to save into our database. And if you see here, we're giving, I guess you could say, arguments to our HTML tags. This is just to configure the HTML tag. There are lots of different things you can do, and we'll go through some of them in a bit. But let's just create all our input boxes first. So let's just first name, we need last name, right? So everything we're putting here, we're trying to mimic what we had in our server file. So what do we have here? We had first name, last name, age, username, password, and description. So we're gonna have last name, and then we're gonna put age here. I mean not age, number here, because when we're giving an age, it's not going to be text. And I'm gonna fill out the placeholders. Placeholders is just what you see inside the box before the user actually types anything. It gets deleted once they start typing. What's next? Username, password, and description. Right. So now you can see all the input boxes have their relevant placeholders. We're also going to give age another property, which is what these argument kind of things are called. We're going to call it min 0. So the minimum this age box can go to is 0, right? Because you can't be less than 0 years old, which makes sense. Next thing we're going to need to do is we're going to need a way to actually save the data. Oh, actually, I'm going to kind of reformat this just so it looks a bit better, because the way it looks right now is a bit interesting. I'm going to make a CSS file for this, register.css, and then we're going to have to import this CSS file up here. So import register.css, .css. And there's a thing in CSS called classes, and that lets you grab onto specific tags, right, to format. So normally, like I showed you before, we used h1 to grab onto a h1 tag, right? But you don't necessarily have to use these tags. You can also create your own custom ways to identify tags. So we're going to give it class name, register container, because it is holding our register box. And we're going to go to our CSS file. We're going to put a dot in front of the class name, and now we have officially hooked onto the register container, and we can manipulate its style using this CSS object. So what we're going to do is we're going to display flex, and then we're going to direction column. Also, you can combine different CSS identifiers to be more specific on what you want to grab. So I want to grab the form tag inside this div. So I'm just going to write form here, and it's going to combine together. So now we can grab the actual object, the actual HTML element inside, and we're just going to make it face vertically so it looks a bit better. And we might give it a bit of breathing room, so padding 5 pixels. Oh wait, that is the wrong one. So register, container, form, and then we're going to combine another one. So we're going to go one more in. We're going to go to inputs, and then we're going to give everything a bit of padding so you can... Actually, let's make a board margin. So everything has a bit of breathing room. It's a bit too much. There you go. Yeah, so now we've formatted our register box, right? So how do we actually save the data that goes in here, and how do we actually how are we actually going to send it, right? To do that, we're going to introduce something called hooks, and specifically one called use state. So what hooks are basically functions, and they were written and created by Facebook to help people use React. Now, the reason why you need these hooks is because of the way React actually works. So this is where, how I talked about before, that frameworks do require you to write your code in a specific way to adhere to the framework's syntax. We're going to use a hook called useState. First, we need to import useState. If you see up here, like I said before, useState is not a default export. This React object is. So, if you don't, if you just export something without writing default after it, you would need to grab it like this. So we're just gonna grab useState. I'm gonna import that, and then I'm gonna use a useState snippet, which is just we got that from the extension that I showed you guys before. And we're just going to do a quick run through of useState and why it's necessary, right? So let's just put some stuff in here, and I'll explain what's going on in a second. I'm just going to create some stuff. Button. Actually, no. This way. Okay, so what I've created now is, wait, let me just render the button as well. What I've done now is I've created two variables, right? So state itself is a variable, and set state is how you change what's inside this variable, right? And you might be wondering why we need this, long way to hold data inside our component. And the reason is because when we make changes to our entire component needs to re-render because it needs to reflect the data changes, right? Otherwise, if this thing never re-rendered and we changed the data inside the component will just show the old data. It just never changes, right? And that's not what we want. However, because the component re-renders, right? This component is a function. So what happens is this entire function like runs from top to bottom, right? And if you guys have dealt with functions before, every time you run a function, everything inside is reset. So we can't just use let x equals 0 because if we click this button, what's happening is we're going to grab this. We're going to use set state to change what's inside the state variable. We're going to take the previous value of the state and we're going to add 1 to it. And similarly to x, we're going to get the previous value of x and we're going to add 1 to it, right? So if these things were to maintain their values between different renders, both the x and the state will keep going up by 1. But you can see that only state is increasing. And that's because every time we click this, it's going to reset our state. Not reset, but it's going to change our state, which causes this entire function to re-render. And when this thing re-renders, it's going to cause everything inside to be reset. So what happens when we do onClick is initially x equals x plus 1, so this x value does turn into 1. But then what happens is this whole function will run again, and then x is reset to 0. And then it renders 0 again, which is why it never increments up, because it never changes from 0. It changes from 0 to 1 briefly when we activate this function, but then it just never does it again afterwards. And it gets reset back to 0. This 0 in this useState function that we give, it is the initial value. So if we were to refresh our page, the initial value to our state variable goes into this setState function. So let's make this 5. Let's save. And now you can see if we refresh our page, 5 is the initial value that goes into our state variable, which is being rendered down here. You might be wondering what onClick is. So it's like another property that we're using. When it comes to HTML and your browser, there are these things called events, and events are just things that the user does, I guess. So maybe you click on something, maybe your mouse hovers over something, maybe you press a certain key, that's called like a keystroke event. There are like lots of different events, so JavaScript events. There's like a whole list of these. And each event comes with like, it comes with its own features and properties, and you can manipulate your app based on whatever event occurs and the context and details around that event happening. So we're going to use the onClick event for our app because we're going to be submitting our form, which requires a button click. So we're going to undo that. And does anyone have any questions about state? If not, I'll keep going, but feel free to drop a question in the chat. Now we have to keep track of all our inputs inside our input boxes, right? So we're going to just create state for this. So use state snippet first name. I'm going to give it an empty string as an initial argument, and we're just going to create a bunch of these. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and then So each state variable obviously can only hold one value at a time. So we're going to make one variable to hold the data for each input box. We're also going to make the initial value for age to be 0 because age is a number, not a string, so we don't need to give it an empty string. And we're also going to need to create a button for our users to actually submit, right, their input. So we're going to call this the submit button. And we're going to give it a type submit. And what happens when the user clicks this button is that it will trigger the onSubmit event for this form. So the form itself is where we will be putting the submit event, so on submit. And we will be putting a event handler in here to deal with it. Yeah, so state is kind of just like the value of a variable, right? So it needs to persist between like renders of your app or your components, because when a component re-renders, we don't want to restart the component. We still want to keep all the data that we had before that component re-rendered, and that's why we use state, because when we use state, your data will persist between renders. But if we use like normal variables, your data will be lost every time you reset your or re-render your component. Um, what are we doing now? Oh yeah, right. So now we have our state and we have our input boxes, but we need to somehow link our state to our input boxes, right? And to do this, we're gonna use an event called onChange. So onChange. I'm just gonna open this up a bit to make it easier to see. OnChange, and we're going to use an arrow function, and we're going to just set the relevant state. And what we're going to change this state variable to is every time you have a event, you get an event object that comes with it. And this event object will give you details of the particular event. For our particular onChange event, the details will be what is the current state of the input box. So to get that, we're going to do target, the property of target, and I think it's value. If I can just double check. Yep. So now that we have this event, every time the input box for our React app changes, our component is going to re-render. If I can just make this a bit, don't need this anymore. Okay. So if I put this state down here, right? So first name, right? All right. Let's get rid of this for now. If I put first name here, right, and then it'll be a bit hard to see because no, it won't. Okay. So now you can see every time I type into this input box, this variable is saving what we're putting into this input box. Because what's happening is every time like I press one key down into this input box, what is inside this input box is changing. And that will trigger the onChange event. And when that triggers, it's going to execute whatever function we give this onChange event. And the function that we have given it basically takes an argument of the event object, and then it calls another function inside the function, and that function is our set first name. If you've noticed, all of our the functions that set the state, they all begin with state, and then the relevant variable afterwards. That's just the convention. But we are going to call our set first name, and that is going to change the value of the first name inside our React app. So you can see that our data is like now persisting, right? Now we're just going to do this exact same thing with every single other input. So we can just do this here, do this here, do this here, do this here, do this here. And now we're going to just set last name, set age. I'm We're going to put all the relevant state setters with their relevant input boxes. And if I were to, just, for example, username, right? If I were to put something in username, that will render. If I put something in first name, that will render. If I put something in last name, that won't render because I haven't actually written it down here. But another thing that we should do is we should make our password box actually reflect a password box, because right now if you type in your password, you can actually see what you're typing in. And if you've ever made a password before, you can tell that they censor it. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to our password box. We're going to change this type to password. And now it should become dots. So now it's censored. Alright, and with age, it's just numbers. So if we put age here, save it. This BR tag is just like a line break, so I'm just going to make it easier to see. But you can see that our state is saved between renders, and whatever we put in is what is put out. I think I just closed my window. Okay, 1 second. I will just reopen it. Okay, there we go. It's back. Yeah. Now we're going to delete this first because we don't need that anymore, but we are going to actually submit this to our backend now, right? So how do we do this? We're going to create a event handler that executes when we submit our file, right? So let's just save this for a second. And when the user clicks this submit button, right, because this button is of type submit, it's going to go to the parent form tag and it's going to trigger the onSubmit event. So if we do onSubmit, we're going to create a function that handles the submit. So let's just create a function here. So function submit handler. And for the arguments, we're going to take the event object and we're going to start making the event handler. First thing we're going to do is we're going to prevent the default function of this event. So basically, when this event triggers, normally what happens is your page refreshes. You don't want your page to refresh. So prevent default. So by calling this function on the event handler or the event object, your function will no longer, your page will no longer refresh, which is the default behavior of the onSubmit event. So I'm just going to pass this submit handler here. And now if we save this, if you look at the top corner of this refresh button, if I click it, it's not executing, right? It's not refreshing. If I were to get rid of it, oh wait, whoops. Yeah, you can see that it slightly triggers because it's refreshing. So the reason why we don't want this is because let's just put some state again, right? First name. If we save this and then we write some state, if we submit, our page refreshes and we lose all our state. If your React page refreshes, you lose all the state that you had before. But if we prevent the default behavior, right, and we write our first name, if we submit, we're no longer refreshing the page. React apps are called single page applications because it's only a single page. It doesn't refresh. Everything on the page dynamically updates. But you can see now that our submit button no longer refreshes the page, so we don't lose our state. But we are going to delete this because we don't need it. But what we are going to do with our data, right, is we're going to create our user object. So const user equals, and this object is what we're going to be sending to our backend, to the register HTTP endpoint. So first name. Oh, I don't think you even need to do this. With JavaScript objects, if you just give the name of the variable, I don't think you need to write you don't need to associate the actual value of that variable after. So you could do something like last name, but I'm pretty sure you can also just do age, username, password, description. I think this works. We'll just test it out right now. So we'll just console log our user every time we submit, right? Let's refresh everything. I'm gonna save it, and then first name, Rob, last name, Cha, age, 3, username. I don't know, I'm not very creative, but this will do. And then for description, I don't know, likes CSE. And then we're gonna submit. Don't save, but let's look at our console. And here you can see our object that we just console logged, right? So if we zoom in, you can see all the relevant fields that we put in, and it's like all filled out. And now we can finally send this to our backend, and our backend is going to process it and put it into our database. So let's do that right now. We can console log it actually. To do that, we're going to use another inbuilt function for JavaScript called fetch. So const response. So this is going to hold the response to our HTTP request, because our fetch function is what actually is going to send our HTTP request from our JavaScript file or our frontend server. So, and it's an await function, so we have to put async in front of this. And then await fetch. And the first argument for fetch is the actual HTTP endpoint that we're sending to. So that one would be our register endpoint. I think we also can't use localhost as the URL here. We're going to have to change it to this URL, but this should hit our backend endpoint, right? So the first argument to fetch is our URL. The second, this could be like whatever like your API or URL you're trying to hit. This could be like www.facebook. Whatever API you want. But since we're using our own custom backend, we're going to use this string. And the second argument that our fetch function takes is an object, and this object just lets us configure the actual HTTP request. So this is where we're going to put the fact that our request right now is a post request. So post, and then headers. Headers are just to give a bit more information to your backend about like what's going on with your HTTP request. For us, we're just going to tell the backend that the content is going to be a JSON string. And then for the body of the request, this is where we actually put the data that we want to give. And we're going to do JSON.stringify user. So what this is doing is it's basically taking our object and it's turning it into a JSON string, right? And now we can get the returned data from our response object. So what we do is const return data equals await response dot JSON, and then we're gonna console log it. So return data. Okay, so what this is doing is it's going to take a JSON string and it's going to change it into a JavaScript object. So stringify changes an object to a JSON string. JSON changes a JSON string to an object, right? So pretty sure that's how it works, but we're going to save this, and first let's take a look at our database. Oh yeah, I closed it. Let me just reopen it. I think this is the one we used. Yep. Okay, so you see right now there should only be 2 entries, right? We can now try send our new user to the backend. Right, we've submitted all of this, and we're just gonna submit. And now we have an error. The error is cross-origin request blocked. So cause error. This is a very common error that a lot of people, well, at least I got a lot when I first started. But yeah, the way to fix this is, the reason you're getting this is because you can't just send like your requests from your front end to like any random backend if they don't let you, right? So what you need to do is you need to go to your or our server API backend, and basically what's happening is from our front end we're going to send our user data to our backend, and then our backend is going to be like, what the hell, where's this request coming from? Like, we don't want it, and then it throws an error. So to get around this, we need to download another npm add-on called cause. I'm gonna have to unfortunately stop our database for a second, and we're gonna do npm I cors. And once we've downloaded it, we can now use it. First we need to import it, like we import all the other stuff. So import cause from cause, and then we're going to use a middleware function in this cause. So app.use core, and then core itself, cause, and then cause itself takes an argument, which is an object, and we're going to do origin http, and for this one we can use localhost. Localhost, I think we're using 3001 port. We can do it that way. We can save, and then we can try send it. Oh no, we need to run the server again. And then we can submit. Wait, let's clear our console log, and then we're gonna submit, and we're gonna refresh our database. And there he is. There is Rob. We have officially created a very, very simple full stack MERN app, right? We have a front end built in React. We have a server built with Node.js and Express, and we have a MongoDB database that we are connected to, and we can put stuff in. So we have officially, technically, we have created a full stack app. Yeah, if there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. Otherwise, we're gonna quickly go over, or not really go over, but we're gonna do the login function as well, because we are quite over time. So to create the login functionality, we're gonna go to components. We're gonna add a new file, login.js. We're gonna RFC, and then login.css, style it a bit better, and then we're gonna so basically we need to import our CSS file like we did for the register page. So and now we are also going to need to import this component, this login functional component, to our app component. it's like a Lego block, right? You're putting your app you're putting your login component into your app component, and it kind of just like slowly gets put together like a sandwich. Like your app component is like the largest, like it's like the bread, right? And then your login is like the inner stuff. We're gonna use our login, and the login auto imports. This is probably due to one of the snippets I'm using. Feel free to just like play around with the snippets and see what like functionalities and benefits they give you, and see what you can what shortcuts you get with them, I guess. We're gonna open up our login, and now you can see we're using our login component instead of our register. If I were to uncomment that and save that, you would get the app component. If we were to do both, you get both of them at one time. We're going to just work on our login component real quick. Very similar to the app, the register functionality. We're gonna just, you can honestly just copy paste the whole thing. Because we're a bit low on time, I'm just gonna do this, and we only need the username and password, so we're gonna delete this. We're gonna delete the age, first name, last name. Don't need any of it, and then we're gonna take this. Right, so basically what we've done is we've copy pasted. Oh, right, sorry. So what we've done is we've copy pasted most of the layout of our register function into our login function, because essentially what we're doing is we're still basically just using like an input box, and then we're sending the data inside those input boxes to the backend. If you remember on our server.js, right? All we need to put into our login is a username and password field, which is what we are going to be keeping track of here. So we're going to make a post request, and we're going to get we're going to await for the return value, and hopefully this should just work as is. Let's take a look at a user. Okay, let's take BB, and then password is password. And we're going to try submit this. We're going to clear that, submit, and you can see that. Oh wait, no, something has gone wrong. User validation, first name path is required, last name is required, ages. Okay. There seems to be an issue with the schema, because the schema requires us to put in certain values. Let me just quickly try and figure this out. I don't need any of this. Oh, right. Okay, I know why now. Basically, in our login page, right, we copy pasted a lot of stuff, but we forgot to change the endpoint. So we're actually sending our data to the register endpoint that we created, but we want to send it to our login endpoint, right? So let's save that. Let's try again. And now we have the correct response object. And notice that the password is missing because when we created our server, we got rid of the password. And yeah, that's it. That's the entire app. Um, Sorry for going 32 minutes over time. I hope you guys enjoyed this MERN full stack tutorial. Yeah, I hope this is, your introduction to web development and maybe your first step into a very wide range and field. Um, we do have some resources set up for further learning, but I'm gonna have to create a Google Doc for that. Bear with me for a second. I'll just quickly make it and I'll just paste some stuff in. Um, so I posted a Google Doc inside the chat. Hopefully it works. For JWTs, yeah, probably not gonna go over deployment or web tokens in this one because we are done with the workshop and we are pretty over time. But yeah, if the Google Doc works, there should be some more resources added later on. But for now, feel free to take a look and I guess keep learning. Um, yeah, I think this is the end of the stream. Gordon, do I just close it? Is that it? Oh wait, no. Right. Sorry, I have to advertise some stuff. Um, there is a Facebook, not Facebook event. There's another CSE education event for MERN held on Tuesday this week. You can check the CSE Facebook page for more details. In this event, it's an IRL event, and I think it goes from 3 to 5, and there will be actual MERN exercises in there, so you will be coding this yourself. Not necessarily this login application, but there are lots of little component exercises for you to do. There will be like people who are familiar with MERN who will be going around the room helping you if you are stuck on anything. They'll be happy to explain anything to you. Um, it's a great place to, I guess, leverage anything you've learnt today. Even if you're a bit fuzzy on some of the concepts we learnt here today, you can definitely strengthen your knowledge of the MERN stack. And yeah, go to that workshop and take a look. And I think it'll be very beneficial if you are trying to get into MERN. Um, yeah, I'm just gonna end the stream now because I think it's done. Thanks for coming. I hope you enjoyed it. Yep, there's a event in the chat now. You can take a look. Uh, yeah. Bye, guys.